72 hours before a government shutdown inside the Oval Office, the President of the United States stood up and walked out of the most critical budget negotiation in decades. Not a strategic pause, not a bathroom break, a complete abandonment of talks that could keep federal agencies operational past Friday at midnight. According to sources present in the room, the silence that followed lasted nearly 30 seconds. Congressional leadership sat frozen as the door closed behind him, leaving Speaker Johnson, Senate Majority Leader Schumer, and Treasury Secretary Yellen staring at empty chairs and unfinished business that affects every American. Think about what that means. We're talking about a meeting that determines whether Social Security checks get mailed, whether air traffic controllers report for duty, whether national parks stay open. The president walked away from negotiations over a disagreement about infrastructure spending allocations that represents less than 2% of the total federal budget. Representative Johnson later described the moment as unprecedented. The speaker stated, "We were making real progress on finding middle ground, and then suddenly we were sitting alone with our notes and no clear path forward." Here's the thing. This wasn't the first time tensions had escalated during these budget talks. But sources familiar with the discussions say this marked a complete breakdown of the collaborative process that keeps government functioning. What triggered the walkout was a proposal to reduce highway infrastructure spending by $8 billion over 3 years, $8 billion out of a $4.7 trillion budget. The Treasury Secretary immediately began calculating contingency plans for essential services. Federal agencies received preliminary shutdown notices within an hour. Markets started reacting before most Americans even knew what had happened. While the president was walking toward the residence wing, congressional leaders were placing emergency calls to their caucuses. Senator Schumer told colleagues, "We have never seen anything like this level of disengagement from the executive branch during a fiscal crisis." White House staff scrambled to manage communications as word spread through the West Wing. Press Secretary Williams found herself fielding questions about constitutional obligations and basic governance responsibilities. The administration that promised to run government like a business had just demonstrated what happens when the CEO walks out of the most important board meeting of the year. By 3:15 that afternoon, federal employee unions were issuing statements about shutdown preparations. The American Federation of Government Employees confirmed that agencies had activated their contingency protocols. We're talking about 800,000 federal workers facing furloughs because of one person's decision to leave a room. This isn't typical Washington dysfunction. This is the complete breakdown of basic negotiation processes that have sustained American democracy for 2.5 centuries. The president left with no explanation, no timeline for resuming talks, and no apparent concern for the consequences facing millions of Americans who depend on federal services. That meeting was supposed to last until they reached an agreement. Instead, it lasted exactly 97 minutes before the most powerful person in America decided he had somewhere else to be. Think about what that signals about priorities, about responsibility, about the basic job requirements of presidential leadership. The clock was already ticking when those talks began. Now we're down to 71 hours and 53 minutes before the federal government runs out of money, and the person with the constitutional authority to sign spending bills just walked away from the table. The walkout didn't happen in a vacuum. For 3 weeks, congressional leadership had watched negotiations deteriorate as the president's demands became increasingly disconnected from fiscal reality. What started as standard budget discussions had transformed into a test of whether basic governance could survive one person's refusal to compromise. According to sources familiar with the negotiations, the pattern had been consistent. The president would arrive late, demand changes to previously agreed provisions, then express frustration when lawmakers explained constitutional limitations on executive spending authority. House Budget Committee Chairman Williams described it as negotiating with someone who fundamentally misunderstood how federal budgets actually work. The breaking point had been building since December 28th. That's when the president first proposed cutting infrastructure spending, while simultaneously demanding increases for projects that hadn't undergone proper congressional authorization. Sources speaking on background called it the most economically reckless combination of demands they'd encountered in decades of budget negotiations. Here's what makes this particularly devastating. The federal deficit had already reached $8.4 trillion. Every serious economist agreed that responsible spending required careful balancing of essential services against fiscal sustainability. The president's approach ignored both requirements while creating maximum political chaos. Think about the sequence of events. January 2nd, the president demanded a $12 billion increase for unspecified border infrastructure. January 3rd, he insisted on cutting education funding that had bipartisan support. January 4th, he threatened to veto any spending bill that didn't include provisions his own Treasury Department had called financially impossible to implement. Representative Martinez, who attended all preliminary meetings, told colleagues the president seemed to view budget negotiations as personal grievance sessions rather than policy discussions. She stated, "We would spend 40 minutes explaining why certain expenditures require legislative approval, and he would respond by demanding we figure out how to make it work anyway." By January 6th, key Republican allies had begun privately expressing concerns about the president's approach. Senator Thompson, typically a reliable administration supporter, told associates that the demands had become incompatible with basic fiscal responsibility. Sources confirmed that Thompson personally urged the president to reconsider his negotiation strategy before Tuesday's critical meeting. The Treasury Secretary had warned about debt ceiling implications if negotiations failed. Secretary Yellen presented detailed projections showing that a government shutdown would cost the economy approximately $6 billion per day in lost productivity. The president's response, according to witnesses, was to question why economists always focused on numbers instead of results. That comment revealed everything. We're talking about someone treating the federal budget like a personal expense account while ignoring the mathematical realities that determine whether government can function. Constitutional experts had already begun discussing whether such fundamental misunderstanding of executive responsibilities constituted a breach of presidential duties. Behind the scenes, congressional leadership had attempted extraordinary measures to salvage the process. Speaker Johnson personally met with the president twice to explain why certain demands violated separation of powers principles. Senate Majority Leader Schumer had arranged briefings with constitutional scholars to clarify executive authority limitations. Nothing penetrated. The most telling moment came January 7th, just one day before the walkout. During preliminary discussions, the president was asked to prioritize his spending preferences within available revenue. Sources say he responded by insisting that prioritization was Congress's job, not his. That's not how constitutional governance works. That's not how any functional democracy operates. Former Treasury officials from previous administrations watched these developments with growing alarm. Secretary Paulson stated publicly, "We have never witnessed such fundamental disconnection between presidential demands and economic reality during a fiscal crisis." The Wednesday morning meeting was supposed to be the final opportunity to prevent disaster. Congressional leaders arrived with compromise proposals that addressed every reasonable concern while maintaining fiscal discipline. They expected difficult negotiations. They didn't expect the president to abandon the process entirely when presented with mathematical constraints on his demands. What they got instead was 97 minutes of circular discussions, followed by complete abandonment of responsibility. The person constitutionally required to execute congressional spending decisions had walked away from the basic process that makes those decisions possible. The news broke at 3:27 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Within 12 minutes, the Dow Jones had dropped 143 points. By market close, we were looking at a $400 billion loss in total market capitalization. That's the immediate price of presidential abandonment of basic governance responsibilities. Speaker Johnson emerged from the Oval Office to find reporters already gathering outside the West Wing. Sources confirmed that news of the walkout had leaked through staff channels before congressional leadership could even reconvene. The speaker's first statement was devastatingly simple. "We will continue working to prevent a shutdown with or without presidential participation." Think about what that means. The Speaker of the House had just announced that Congress would attempt to govern around the president, not with the president, around him. That's not a political strategy. That's a constitutional crisis. Treasury Secretary Yellen immediately convened an emergency meeting with Federal Reserve officials to discuss market stability measures. Sources familiar with the discussion say the Secretary's primary concern was preventing international confidence collapse in American governmental institutions. The dollar had already begun weakening against major currencies as news spread through global financial networks. Meanwhile, Senate Majority Leader Schumer was placing urgent calls to ranking committee members. According to congressional sources, the Senate leadership decided within 45 minutes to proceed with emergency spending legislation that could pass without presidential input. They were essentially preparing to govern without the executive branch. The White House press corps received notification of an emergency briefing at 4:15 p.m. Press Secretary Williams faced questions she had never anticipated needing to answer. When asked whether the president intended to resume budget negotiations, her response was telling, "The president's schedule remains flexible and we continue to prioritize fiscal responsibility." That wasn't an answer. That was damage control for behavior that had no reasonable explanation. Federal agencies began activating shutdown protocols within 2 hours of the walkout. The Office of Management and Budget issued preliminary furlough notices to department heads. 800,000 federal employees received emails instructing them to prepare for unpaid leave beginning Friday at midnight. The human cost of one person's decision to abandon responsibility was spreading through every level of government. International allies started reaching out through diplomatic channels. According to State Department sources, European Union representatives expressed concerns about American reliability during ongoing NATO budget discussions. Japanese officials postponed trade agreement negotiations. The president's behavior was undermining American credibility on multiple continents simultaneously. By 6 p.m., social media was exploding with reactions from political figures across the spectrum. Former Republican Treasury Secretary Mnuchin posted, "Constitutional obligations don't end when negotiations become difficult." Current and former officials were publicly questioning presidential fitness for office in language typically reserved for constitutional crises. The most damaging response came from Senator Thompson, the president's typically reliable ally. Thompson stated, "I cannot defend abandoning fiscal responsibility negotiations during a government funding crisis. When your most consistent supporters start using words like cannot defend, you've crossed a line that threatens institutional legitimacy." Financial markets in Asia opened to immediate selling pressure. The Nikkei dropped 2.3% in the first hour of trading. European futures markets indicated similar declines. We were watching real-time economic consequences of American governmental dysfunction spread through global financial systems. Congressional leadership worked through the evening drafting emergency legislation. According to sources familiar with the process, both chambers were preparing to pass continuing resolutions that would bypass presidential involvement entirely. The legislative branch was preparing to govern independently because the executive branch had demonstrated unwillingness to fulfill basic constitutional functions. By midnight, federal agencies had completed preliminary shutdown preparations. National parks prepared closure notices. Social Security Administration warned of potential payment delays. The Internal Revenue Service suspended non-essential operations planning. The machinery of American government was grinding toward a halt because one person walked out of a meeting. The president's behavior had transformed routine budget negotiations into a constitutional crisis that threatened American economic stability, international credibility, and basic governmental functionality. And it gets worse. Congressional leaders were discovering that this level of executive abandonment of responsibility had no clear constitutional remedy. We're not talking about policy disagreements. We're talking about fundamental breakdown of the collaborative governance that makes democracy possible. The president had redefined presidential authority to include walking away from constitutional obligations whenever negotiations became inconvenient. By Thursday morning, the House Oversight Committee had announced a formal inquiry into presidential conduct during the budget crisis. Committee Chairman Davidson stated, "When basic constitutional obligations are abandoned, Congress must investigate whether executive responsibilities have been systematically violated. That's not political theater. That's constitutional accountability. The investigation moved with unprecedented speed. Within 18 hours of the walkout, committee staff had issued subpoenas for all recordings, transcripts, and documentation from the failed budget meetings. Sources familiar with the process confirm that investigators were particularly interested in establishing patterns of executive dysfunction beyond the single dramatic incident. Constitutional law professor Sarah Chen from Georgetown University provided devastating analysis to the committee. She testified, presidential participation in budget negotiations isn't a courtesy to Congress. It's a constitutional requirement. When the executive branch abandons this responsibility, we're looking at potential violations of the Take Care Clause that require formal investigation. Here's what investigators discovered immediately. The walkout wasn't an isolated incident. According to documents obtained by the committee, the president had left 3 previous budget meetings early over the past 18 months. Each departure had occurred when presented with mathematical constraints on spending demands. That's a pattern of abandoning constitutional responsibilities whenever reality conflicts with preferences. Ethics experts weighed in with unprecedented unanimity. Former White House counsel Davis stated, presidential authority includes the obligation to engage in good faith negotiations with Congress. Walking away from fiscal crisis discussions represents a fundamental breach of executive duties. The legal community was coalescing around conclusions that spelled serious constitutional trouble. The subpoenas yielded immediate results. Audio recordings from the January 8th meeting revealed the president's exact words before leaving. "I'm not going to sit here and listen to people tell me what I can't do." That statement, according to constitutional scholars, demonstrated fundamental misunderstanding of presidential limitations and separation of powers principles. Senator Williams, ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, announced expanded investigation scope. The committee would examine whether the pattern of abandoned negotiations constituted systematic violation of presidential oath obligations. Williams stated, "We're not investigating policy disagreements. We're investigating whether basic constitutional duties have been repeatedly violated." The documentary evidence proved devastating. White House logs showed the president had attended only 60% of scheduled budget meetings over the past year. When he did attend, average participation time was 37 minutes before finding reasons to leave early. Constitutional experts called this the most comprehensive abandonment of fiscal responsibility duties in presidential history. Witness interviews began Thursday evening. House Budget Committee staff questioned Treasury officials about the president's understanding of constitutional spending limitations. According to sources familiar with the interviews, Treasury staff described repeated incidents where the president demanded actions that violated statutory budget authority. The interviews revealed systematic disconnection from constitutional governance requirements. Legal scholars started drawing historical parallels. Professor Martinez from Harvard Law School published analysis comparing the current situation to constitutional crises that had triggered impeachment proceedings. She wrote, "When presidents systematically abandon constitutional duties, Congress faces obligation to determine whether executive functions can continue under current leadership." The investigation uncovered additional concerning incidents. Sources confirmed that the president had attempted to order Treasury officials to redirect congressionally appropriated funds without legislative authorization. Such orders, if followed, would have violated the constitutional prohibition on executive control of federal spending. Treasury officials had quietly refused to comply while documenting the illegal requests. Even conservative legal experts expressed alarm. Federalist Society member Professor Thompson stated, "Presidential authority operates within constitutional boundaries. Systematic attempts to govern outside those boundaries represent fundamental threats to constitutional order." The conservative legal establishment was abandoning any pretense that this behavior fell within acceptable presidential conduct. The committee's preliminary findings painted a picture of systematic constitutional violation. According to leaked documents, investigators had identified at least 12 instances over 18 months where the president had either abandoned required negotiations or demanded actions that violated constitutional spending limitations. Each incident represented potential grounds for constitutional accountability measures. International constitutional experts added global perspective. Professor Heinrich from Oxford University stated, "Democratic systems require executive branches that respect constitutional limitations. When presidents systematically ignore those boundaries, international partners question regime stability and institutional reliability. Opposition leaders seized on the investigation findings to build broader accountability cases. House Democratic leadership announced they were reviewing all committee findings to determine whether impeachment proceedings might be constitutionally required. They weren't threatening political retribution. They were describing potential constitutional obligations. The investigation had revealed something unprecedented in American constitutional history. We weren't looking at isolated incidents of poor judgment. We were examining systematic abandonment of constitutional duties by someone constitutionally required to ensure that laws are faithfully executed. The evidence suggested that basic executive responsibilities had been repeatedly violated through a pattern of abandoning governance whenever constitutional constraints conflicted with personal preferences. The government shutdown entered its fourth day as constitutional scholars grappled with unprecedented questions about presidential power and institutional survival. What started as a budget crisis had evolved into fundamental challenges to the frameworks that make American democracy function. We're not talking about temporary political dysfunction. We're examining whether constitutional governance can withstand systematic abandonment of executive responsibilities. International allies were recalculating their strategic relationships with the United States. According to diplomatic sources, European Union leadership postponed critical defense cooperation agreements, pending resolution of what they termed American governmental instability. NATO partners questioned whether treaty obligations could be reliable when the American executive branch demonstrated willingness to abandon basic governance responsibilities. Professor Elena Rodriguez from Columbia Law School provided devastating analysis of the constitutional implications. She testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee, when presidents systematically violate their constitutional oath to faithfully execute the laws, we face institutional collapse. The Take Care Clause isn't a suggestion. It's the foundational requirement that makes executive power legitimate within our constitutional framework. Financial markets continued hemorrhaging value as the shutdown extended. The Dow Jones had lost over 800 points since the walkout. More significantly, international bond markets were beginning to price in American political risk premiums that hadn't existed since the Civil War. Credit rating agencies warned that systematic governmental dysfunction could trigger sovereign debt downgrades with catastrophic economic consequences. Think about what we're witnessing. Federal employees remained furloughed while their government spiraled into constitutional crisis. Social Security Administration offices stayed closed. Veterans Affairs delayed benefit processing. National parks locked their gates. The human cost of presidential abandonment was spreading through every community that depends on federal services. Constitutional historian David Chen published analysis comparing the current crisis to the most serious institutional challenges in American history. He wrote, "The Watergate crisis involved criminal behavior by a president who nonetheless continued attempting to govern. We're now confronting something potentially more dangerous, systematic abandonment of governance itself by someone constitutionally required to ensure governmental functionality." Legal experts began discussing remedies that had never been seriously considered. Harvard Law professor Martinez stated, "When presidents systematically refuse to fulfill constitutional obligations, Congress faces potential duty to consider whether executive functions can continue under current leadership." These aren't political questions, these are constitutional requirements. The international community was drawing conclusions about American institutional reliability. Chinese officials publicly questioned whether trade agreements could be dependable when American executive authority operated outside constitutional constraints. Russian diplomatic sources suggested that American governmental chaos created opportunities for revisionist powers to challenge international order. Here's what makes this particularly devastating. The president's behavior had damaged American credibility precisely when global leadership required institutional stability. Climate negotiations stalled. Nuclear non-proliferation talks faced postponement. International partners were governing around American unreliability rather than depending on American leadership. Congressional leadership faced impossible choices.